In this section, we are going to look at examining host resource allocation. As you are already aware, building virtualization hosts requires careful consideration, but it requires careful consideration in a few different areas. And in the area of the host, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate amount of compute resources. So we'll be discussing what those compute resources are specifically. We know disk, network, CPU, and memory, but what are the subcomponents that are utilized? And what are some of the ways in which we can ensure that the host has enough of those resources to allocate to virtual machines? Well, you'll learn about quotas and limits, reservations, resource pools, and even licensing requirements for virtualization host. In a cloud computing environment, properly distributing compute resources is probably one of the most important aspects of a virtualized infrastructure. And that's because it's going to, identify or give us the appropriate level of performance now, and it's also going to help us to plan for future growth and be able to adjust those resources. When we build virtualization hosts, it's going to require careful consideration and planning. First, the amount of resources that are required for the host and the distribution of those resources to a virtual machine needs to be well thought out and defined. It's also necessary to plan for the actual configuration of the virtual machine that the host will serve. And then thirdly, we need to confirm or determine the licensing of host and virtual machines. That must be attended to in the process of moving to a virtualized environment. So as we go forward, we're going to be looking at some of those considerations, some of those things that we need to take into account to ensure the success of our virtual environment. Now, as mentioned, one of the keys to success is going to be planning and managing the compute resources. This ensures that the host can deliver the performance that's needed to support the virtualization environment. Compute resources can best be defined as resources that are required for the delivery of virtual machines. Okay, they are disk, they are processor, memory, and networking resources that are shared across pools of virtual machines. Essentially underpin the ability to deliver the value of cloud models. Okay, this is the fabric. So fabric, compute resources, essentially all the same thing. So what are some of the subcomponents? That's kind of what we want to focus on. Well, for disk resources, we have the physical rotational disk as well as solid state disk. We have the controller cards, the disk arrays, the host bus adapters for storage area networks, and then the networked storage transmission media. So in some cases that's fiber channel, in some cases that might be Ethernet cabling. So all of those make up the disk resources. So when we think of the disk subsystem, we need to think of all of those resources. Network resources are going to include the network interface cards, of course, and then the physical transmission media such as Ethernet cables that might be employed. CPU is really just the individual processor units, the cores that are employed, and then for RAM, it's the physical banks of memory. I suppose you could include memory controller in there as well, but I just wanted to quantify a little bit what we mean when we say compute resources. These are the host compute resources, processor, disk, memory, and network, and every subcomponent that is involved with delivering those resources to virtual machines. Now, compute resources are limited, and because of this, cloud providers have to be able to protect them. They have to be able to make certain that customers only have access to the amount that the provider is contracted to provide. And another way of saying that is that the customer can only access the amount for which they have paid for. There's two methods that are used to deliver no more than the contracted amount of resources, and those are quotas first and then limits. Let me just expand. The limit is a defined floor or ceiling on the amount of resources that can be used. Quotas are limits defined for a system on the total amount of resources. When you're defining the actual limits on host resources, you do have the option of setting a hard or soft limit. So a hard limit would be a a maximum amount of resources that can be utilized. All right. So, for example, a hard limit of 100 gigabytes for a storage partition is not going to allow anything to be saved to that partition once it reaches 100 gigs, and normally it would log an event, notify the user, etc. Soft limit, on the other hand, will allow the user to save a file even if the drive reaches 100 gigabyte. It'll still log an alert, still notify the user. So what's the difference? Well, the quotas are typically defined for the host system it has to do with the allocation of host compute resources to its guest machines. So these are established according to service level agreements, and they're created between the provider and the customer. They indicate, or they provide the indication of, a specific level of capacity. And the resources that these quotas enforce limits upon could be physical disks, disk arrays, RAM chips, processors, network adapters. They're all allocated from this total pool of resources. Okay, essentially these could be equated to speed limits on a highway, because very often there's both a minimum and a maximum speed that's defined for all the traffic on that particular road. Well, in this case, the quota would be defined as the maximum speed, and the limit would be defined as the minimum speed for all the vehicles that are using that road's resources. All right, so that's sort of the analogy to help you understand quotas and limits. Now, after we design the compute resources, the storage limits, the organization also needs to identify which vendor they're going to use for their virtualization software because of licensing. Each virtualization software vendor has a unique way of licensing their products. So some products are completely free, or have a free version, I should say, requiring a license only if you want to use advanced feature sets. And so if you put in a license, then that enables that additional functionality. And this would be stuff like high availability, performance optimization, systems management, etc. Others may offer a completely free product without offering any advanced features with their product. And even you do have to keep in mind, though, that even free products will require licensing for the virtual machines. Now, choosing the virtualization platform is pretty critical. Licensing is a factor in that step. You need to understand what the vendor is going to require of you before you set on a virtualization platform, okay? And it's more than just that, of course. It has to do with administrative experience as well, what your organization has always used. But like I said, you want to look at the cost for licensing the virtualization product itself, but also keep in mind that you'll always require licensing for the individual virtual machines. Before we move on, there's a couple of other concepts that we need to discuss in relation to host resource allocation. The first is reservations. Reservations work similarly to quotas, but they're designed to operate let me back up. Where quotas are designed to ensure that the correct capacity gets delivered to customers, in that they define an upper limit for resource usage, reservations are designed to operate sort of the other end of the spectrum. So they ensure that a lower limit is enforced for the amount of resources guaranteed to a cloud consumer and, of course, to their virtual machines. Okay? They enable cloud service providers to deliver against their service level agreements, because it helps to ensure that certain virtual machines always have a defined baseline level of resources available to them, regardless of the demands placed by other virtual machines. Then we have resource pools. Resource pools are slices or portions of compute resources, namely CPU, memory, storage, from a single host or a cluster of hosts. But resource pools can be partitioned off in order to provide different levels of resources to a particular group or a particular organization. It can also be nested within a hierarchy for organizational alignment. So it's a very flexible mechanism with which you can organize the sum total of compute resources in a virtual environment and link them back to their underlying physical resources. All of these concepts are going to help as we design our virtualization host. Some of these concepts are really mostly important if you in an at-work situation, if you are working for a cloud provider, and they would be less important for the cloud consumer, although you might see them implemented. All of these are important considerations, of course, for the certification exam. In this section, you learned about host resource allocation, and we discussed the importance of ensuring that your virtualization host have enough resources to allocate, both to themselves for processing, as well as to virtual machines. We also discussed the importance of licensing for both host and virtual machines. Now, on the resource allocation, you learned that compute resources like disk, network, CPU, and memory include a number of other subcomponents, and that we can use quotas and limits as cloud providers to make sure that customers only have access to the amount that they have been contracted to provide. In other words, the amount that they have paid for. So as you learned, quotas define limits on the total amount of resources that you can utilize, whereas a limit is hard or soft. It's a defined floor or ceiling on the amount of resources that you can be used. We also discussed the importance of licensing. All virtualization vendors will have unique ways of licensing. Some will not require licensing for the platform itself, but will require licensing for the virtual machine. Some will require licensing for more advanced feature set. As a cloud professional at work, you're going to have to just know your own particular virtualization platform and understand how to license it.